We F1 fans want to see a disrupting force this year, and Honda wants to be that force, but I think they might have gotten ahead of themselves. And it's meant that we're now not quite sure where Aston Martin is right now. One moment Honda's on the eve of something special, the next the same man admits, their president of racing, Koji Watanabe, saying that not everything is going well, and then likening Max Verstappen to Ayrton Senna. Naturally, that's going to spark up the Max to Aston rumours again. But it's also meant that there's been a weird fog around Aston Martin because, well, you're watching all of this go down. I bet that if you're a fan of Aston Martin right now, you must be absolutely reeling. Right now, you're not quite sure what to believe because you're hearing multiple conversations going on at the same time as to the direction of this team. Are they, as Honda we thought was saying, we're going to be trouncing everybody with something very special in 2026? Or are you believing the ilk of Adrian Newey saying, well, we don't have the right tools, the simulator's not working properly? And if you're not an Aston Martin fan, you just want a team to be a disrupting force that will take down one of the current front-running teams. But Aston Martin, based on what they've been saying the last few years, they seem to be ready to go for 2026. But now that 2026 is actually here, I'm sensing that Aston Martin's now just completely paralyzed and going, And one of those conversations, I think, centers around public belief, because you recall my Audi video yesterday regarding their shakedown that went successfully? Yeah, it might have essentially just been testing that their engine works in a Formula 1 car and it doesn't explode. But the belief that we saw being instilled amongst the casual F1 fandom that may not have cared about Audi, and I can tell you firsthand that not many people cared about Audi in terms of my videos, now they do. All of that got people excited around the project, a brand new F1 engine maker starting off something quite smoothly, weeks before anyone else. Now with Honda returning to full-time F1 involvement, the belief from the community is maybe even more appealing given their successes since 2019. Their first win with Red Bull in the turbo hybrid era, so you think, well, if Audi can be this competent, surely Honda can be even better. And naturally, that's the tone Aston Martin's own website was wishing to peddle, when they actually had the first opportunity to talk to a Honda rep. And this was something I alluded to in my video not that long ago, saying that the Stroll era around Aston Martin might be starting to crumble, and I still stand by that, because the rhetoric that we were getting from Koji Watanabe, who is usually quite reserved and conservative regarding prospects regarding their own operations, was actually quite upbeat, punchy. We're building things up with Aston Martin. We've got 24-hour working with our Sakura plant, and then the works over at Aston. We've got Andy Cowell now on the scene, and he's an engine guy. Oh, it's absolutely fantastic. And we are certainly not seeing a situation that we saw with McLaren in 2015. They clearly learnt a lot from that. And also, Aston Martin, a far more flexible and willing partner, unlike McLaren's Ron Dennis, who wanted the size zero thing, and that pretty much contributed to his ultimate downfall and gardening leave. Capping off with that money shot of being on the eve of something very special. A very deliberate flare-up into the sky, and it goes boom with pretty colours, and we all take notice. It's designed to tell us all, and the people working on this project, that the grind that they've been doing the last couple of years since they announced their partnership with Aston, and going forward, it'll all be worth it. And to be fair, since I made a video about it, the interview did its job. It managed to manifest a heck of a lot of intrigue. Intrigue, but not downright hype. And we just have to hark back to Audi. They went out for a procedural process, which is traditional in Formula 1, and now suddenly everyone's going, oh! And what didn't help Aston's case is that, away from the Aston Martin website, we saw a different tone from Watanabe-san. In a Planet F1 piece, he was far more blunt, saying, not everything is going well. Now, I'm not saying it was doom and gloom. It wasn't triumphant either. This particular chat was more akin to an engineering program deep in the phase where you keep discovering new problems because you've started putting things together into a functional race package. And the surprising part of all of this is that he chose to say it out loud, alongside the other Aston Martin coloured bucket, and then they seem to be conflicting with one another. It just seems a little bit odd, and really gives me the spanner and the foam in thinking that maybe everything is now coming together, and it might be wise just to, push things back a little bit, so that means you don't end up looking like a fool. I can imagine that Audi getting their car out has probably left many people over at Honda with considerably furrowed brows, whilst Binotto, as we saw, is smiling satisfyingly. And let's not forget the leverage going on with Aston Martin itself, and this is where things get spicy. Out of all of the teams on the grid, Aston is by far the loudest entity going in wanting to be a front-running work-style team, all while trying to paint themselves as a coherent top-flight organisation. And it all harks back to expectations and reality, that maybe Aston Martin thought that we might be at a place where we might be quite confident, but then reality is bitten in, and the actual process of going racing and producing something ready for the test in 3 weeks' time, well, actually almost 2 weeks' time, it's getting closer, folks, things might not be quite as rosy, and it might be best to rely on recency bias and saying, hey, we didn't hype ourselves up too much. Because you hear the continued assistance from Adrian Newey that their tools are simply not up to snuff. We heard about this before, earlier in 2025, but it didn't get much notice. I noticed it. And it was all to do with the simulator, that being something that wasn't calibrated properly. And what doesn't help all of us trying to make sense of what's going on over at Aston, are they hyped or are they not hyped, is that this is all coming at the same time within a couple of weeks. You don't know where to look. And then you get the idea that Fernando Alonso is reconsidering the terms and conditions of his retirement. You just get the sense that this team is not quite sure where it is right now, and where you are right now is that you want answers. Where is Aston Martin going to be? Well, as much as we want Aston to win and have the Spaniard pick up his 33rd win, and one of my bold predictions is him adding a 34th too, and your bold predictions is to have him ultimately win the championship. But it seems like the ultimate mission for this team is just to try and survive next year in a better state than they did in 2025, when they really had to survive at the bottom end, with maybe the occasional top 10 placement and absolutely rousing performance from Fernando, because the last third of the season, Lance was absolutely nowhere, and maybe start to properly win in 2027 when they have one glorious whole properly calibrated. And I know that many of you want instant gratification, you want this right now, but I really think some delayed gratification is in order here to prevent a false dawn, because in Aston Martin's short existence in the modern era of Formula 1, they've had a couple of those. And I think also Watanabe-san has had to remind himself of that fact after having so many good times and so many wins with Max Verstappen. But I must hark back to the comments from Newey, particularly around the Aston simulator, which they've admitted is still not correlating properly. It's been described by him as a fundamental research tool, and the team is in the middle of a painful transition. Their facilities exist, but the feedback loops, they're not yet clean. Yeah, they can still probably make a pretty good car with what they've got right now, but they will be gambling more often than they would be comfortable with, and the cost of getting it wrong is really, really big. Not to mention you probably wouldn't be able to discover the car's true potential, and you only have to look back at 2023 and 2024 for moments when they bring some decent upgrades. They think they will work, but then they don't. They go violently off course, and then they have to make massive corrections to eventually get back on an even keel again. 2023, they were winning podiums regularly. After a Canadian upgrade, they fell off. It was only until Qatar when they could be back in the podium placements again. 2024, same result with the Imola upgrade. And with many more big-name partners joining the Aston Martin ship, they cannot have that happen again, where they start off decently, and then they go completely off the rails. And then Lawrence Stroll made a rare statement too. And it does seem very weird considering, again, Aston Martin has one of the biggest plants in the entire Formula 1 world, saying, well, we don't really have the right tools right now to compete. Dad, get me more tools! You could call that damage limitation if you want to be nice, and you'd be right. You can also maybe call it a little bit of self-pity, because he's inside a team that his family has built, now reshaping itself with big money and big partners and bigger expectations, so I can imagine that he's really bricking it right now, since there's more folks who could dub him the scapegoat with less fear of retribution from the Papa. And if you're the Papa, about to hit the track with this brand new car that you've been hyping for the last 2.5 years, it might be time to pump the brakes a little bit and stop hyping themselves up as much. The talk is now over. They've now actually got to get a car out there and properly going through the pre-season testing regime. Time to save oneself from the toxic blame game that we saw over at McLaren, because the last thing that Aston needs right now is this Honda partnership to start off on a really bad note and everyone pointing the finger, and everyone's looking at Fernando. So therefore, there are many pressure valves going off with many key representatives within Aston Martin to let off some steam so as that the backlash that may happen is not nearly as mighty as it might have been if they just carried on chugging ahead at full pelt. Oh, sorry, full steam. I really should have just kept on with the train analogy, sorry. Which is exactly what Honda has done, because with their first public interview representing Aston Martin and not Red Bull for the first time in quite a while, they obviously had to come out with everything sounding like all smiles and sunshine. They can't just say, oh, well, it's really, really difficult, and we're not really sure whether it's going to work or not, they're going to say, oh no, it's great, Aston Martin's fantastic. That article has served its purpose, it's now been left to rot somewhere, only to be drudged up for videos like this, and now we're actually in 2026. We are now actually starting to see the reality sink in, and that maybe this might be a case of, well, we don't want to be seen as being too confident or thinking this is going to be a glorious future. It could easily be that. There are things to be excited about, but not everything is an absolute gravy train. So maybe walk things back in case you end up being burnt alive. Because that's exactly what happened with McLaren a decade ago. It was a public humiliation story, tragedy even. All because expectations ran ahead of reality, with Ron Dennis asking what he was asking for, and then eventually, according to many anecdotes, apologising for it once the car actually hit the track. And what Honda learnt from all of that was that it was best to not talk like you're already winning when you're still debugging the thing. But then they've also got to not diminish the fact that they have been winning for the last few years with an absolutely big generational talent that they are really emotionally connected to still. So you've got this really weird mishmash of communication that you're getting from the team. They're both cautious and proud of what they've been doing and what they've achieved. And therefore, out of all of this, it then births the likening of Max Verstappen to Ayrton Senna. And yeah, you heard me right, even though quite personally, I liken Max Verstappen to Michael Schumacher. This in relation to Verstappen's cultural impact for Honda in native Japan to that of Senna's era, telegraphing to every elite driver on the grid right now that Honda bonds with champions, and Max in particular. He is the most relevant. Yes, their exit then U-turn in 2020 was most likely emotional chaos for Red Bull and Verstappen, but it's surely water under the bridge right now. 4 titles would do that. And also, it helps out Aston Martin in trying to grab some brand new talent. And even though Adrian Newey has basically taken Max Verstappen off their roster in their shortlist for 2027, there are plenty of other candidates amongst the elite that might consider a move to Aston Martin. We've heard Oscar Piastri being rumoured, but I don't really see that happening. George Russell probably might be game, but then Papa Stroll's got something to say about that, since, well, let's just say Lance and George didn't get along in their junior days, so I could easily see a moratorium in that regard. And then, of course, there's Charles Leclerc, but we'll get to that later. And it also helps that Honda is getting more and more feisty in regards to wanting to be in the room when driver negotiations happen, because we've heard that happening over at Toyota with Haas saying that come 2027, they want to have a finger in the pie when it comes to the future talent. Because let's be real, Oliver Behrman, if one of the Ferrari drivers goes, be it Leclerc or Hamilton, oh, he's up to the Scuderia, baby. And now, legitimately, Honda can point to the Dutchman as an example of their partnerships going so well. So much more relevant, because, admittedly, the Senna-Honda relationship is absolutely legendary, but the last title that he won with them was 35 years ago now. The last title Max got with them was in 2024. Just over a year ago. So I think right now, Aston Martin, they're almost ready to go to leave the train station, but I think they've just had a little bit of a technical issue. They're trying to make sure that the entire express goes off smoothly, so it's not quite all guns blazing just yet. Because Aston Martin needs the world to actually believe they will be a force to be reckoned with, and they can talk the talk, but they're not quite sure whether they can walk the walk, and quite frankly, no team can do that right now, unless you're Mercedes, of course. But even then, if their engine goes pop more often than is comfortable, then it wouldn't really matter if they're the fastest anyway, so it's all up in the air. Even Lance is trying to lower the temperature in his own way, and it's all to make sure that people aren't getting the pitchforks out towards the team factory. And you remember the whole thing with Alonso talking about changing the terms of his retirement? That's another way of easing the pressure too, and also self-preservation. Because we all know the quote that Alonso peddled last year, that if Aston nails it in 2026, he'd call it a day. Well, now he's changed his tune, saying he'll keep continuing as long as he remains competitive and fast. No dates attached. Maybe realising that it might have been a mistake to actually peg a specific year. That it might make the team treat him like some kind of short-term asset, and encourage him to don the ambassador's cap or maybe rep the Valkyrie in World Endurance. So, as a result, he is now just saying, we'll see, so long as I'm competitive and fast, I'll just remain in the sport. So it just means that he is constantly moving along, that, like Lance, on paper, the contract that he has with this team is as long as a piece of string. Because do you really think that Aston Martin would go along with the idea of pushing Fernando out of the team right at this point when they need him the most? They need a pillar like Fernando. Say what you will about the past Fernando before he retired in 2018, the Aston Martin Fernando that we have seen has been so much more rousing, motivating, hype-inducing, really mucking in with the grunts and keeping their spirits up, whereas with Lance, well, It's been a little bit the opposite. Yeah, I can imagine that everyone at Aston Martin does not want Fernando to leave, as long as the Spaniard believes that he is fast and he can actually contribute to the team, which right now I don't really see that slowing down anytime soon. He was getting all of the washed accusations in the early half of 2025, and oh, that died a death quickly, didn't it? So thusly, it keeps Lance's seat a little bit more flexible, which matters a lot considering that whilst Max Verstappen may be off limits for now by Newey's own admission, it doesn't mean that somebody like Charles Leclerc might be off the table. There is enough smoke out there to suggest that these two parties could be entwined in some way, including claims that Aston have repeatedly contacted his own manager, which I've discussed before here. Oh, come off it, Law. We've been through this before. Charles Leclerc has devoted himself to Ferrari. Him moving away from the Scuderia, it's almost impossible. The vibe I'm getting from Leclerc is that it's akin to, well, I love you guys, but come on, we really got to step it up here or else I've got no choice. The fact that Charles Leclerc was attached to it and it wasn't being laughed out the door like it was a couple of years ago when this topic came up, that gives you a reason to suggest that, hey, this might actually be legit and we could actually see this happening because, quite frankly, I can't really see Charles Leclerc anywhere else. But then at the same time, Aston can't just pin all of their hopes on Leclerc because, well, they're not pinning their hopes on Max at the moment. Because banking on Leclerc also assumes that Ferrari doesn't sort itself out, but to be fair, the team suffering their third winless year of the 2020s, it really doesn't help their case to keeping Charles. But if the team does fix their core issues and win races again, and they could go for a title run, why would Charles leave? So Aston needs to pitch to Charles that they are a safer bet than Ferrari, more than just being ambitious, and that's no small ask. So where is Papa Stroll in all of this? Well, so far his public posture has been relentless ambition. He talks like someone who doesn't do projects unless they can win things. But when you stop to think about his time in Formula 1, how many wins has a Papa Stroll-backed project been able to manifest? One. And the guy that got them that win was told to pack his bags and leave. There is still work to be done after 8 years of owning the former Force India operation. And that is not talking about all of the stuff that's going on at the Aston Martin car company. You really look to what Papa Stroll's been up to, he is not a glowing example of complete and utter success. And then, of course, there's the obvious element of his son occupying the seat. I know that this has been a topic that's been done to death, but it's still something that needs to be addressed. So, given his ambition, we're assuming that the end game for him includes Lance being involved as part of a championship story, ideally the champion. But if he really wants to win a world title, hard decisions may have to be made about Lance's future. Whether you agree it or not, the fact that we're talking about Leclerc and now Alonso redefining his exit plan into being as long as Lance's piece of string, it must tell you that the tension must be immense right now between the captain and his crew, and his financial backers. Because engineers and racers usually want two things above all else: clarity and stability. They want to know who actually rules the roost, and who makes the big decisions, and that if there's a situation that a big decision blows up in their face, the team won't completely and totally implode. A billionaire executive chairman who is emotionally invested in one of these seats, it can be a stabilizing anchor in that, hey, you know at least one of the drivers will be there next year, but it can also manifest looming uncertainty as to whether or not an emotionally invested billionaire executive chairman could also make emotional decisions. So if you're an engineer who is living in the Silverstone area and maybe considering Aston Martin based on the fact that, hey, you get to be working with Adrian Newey and Fernando Alonso, isn't that great? And a team that has plenty of assets and is only looking upwards in terms of their ambition, you then get Papa Stroll out there when it might become clear that Lance Stroll isn't going to win a world championship or maybe wants to leave the sport entirely. There's nothing really stopping you thinking that one day he might just come out and say, I'm selling the team to Saudi Arabia, I'm leaving, I'm taking my boy with me, goodbye! And then leaving everyone completely uncertain as to the future of their jobs and their livelihoods. It's something that could easily happen. The captain abandoning his own ship. Sure, having First Officer Newey around on the daily helps, but whilst his job security is better than pretty much anyone else working at that team, the captain is still there. So that's why it's important to remember that they need the right tools. The team is trying to prove it can behave like a mature front runner before it actually becomes one. So where are they really as of now? Well, they look like a team that is still in the process of taking off their custom Mercedes store-bought jacket and now stepping into a tailored, bespoke Honda tuxedo. It's safe to say that they are now starting to temper their expectations after spending the last several months, or maybe the last couple of years, blowing smoke up each other's backsides. And admittedly, what they're doing right now in actually being a little bit circumspect and talking about all the challenges and the obstacles they got to overcome is the kind of stuff that you hear many of the big teams talking about themselves. There are many obstacles to overcome, there are realities and expectations to meet, and there's also the matter of trying to find your best supplier of sandbags. Toto Wolff knows a guy. So I think Aston's main mission next year, 2026, is about trying to discover who they truly are now that they are a works team, and whether or not they can capitalize on the absolutely bonkers drivers market that is about to happen, and if they could be the one to convince Charles Leclerc to join them. Whether or not partnering up with Lance or Fernando, that's for another video. The main Aston Martin that we will be seeing, the one they've been championing and trumpeting for so many years, will most likely arrive in 2027. That's when they'll be cashing in on all of their field work. And hey, if we do get a scenario where we have Alonso and Leclerc working together, that's a very impressive lineup. And going into a year where they might be expecting to be absolutely at 100%, and it will certainly generate a lot more appeal and a lot more sponsors, because Charles Leclerc is the second biggest social media influencer within Formula One. And I know that may make some of you sick to your stomach, but that is the truth. Charles Leclerc has a huge presence globally, and he would have chosen to abandon Ferrari and move over to Aston Martin. And then there's also Fernando, and he himself has a decent presence too, and a legacy, going back now a quarter of a century. That is so wild to say, isn't it? Especially wild considering that he hasn't fallen off yet. And what makes you even more excited is that he's been lamenting the ground effect cars, not really liking them, and harking back to the days when he had the light agile cars of his youth where he won his world championships. And with the cars now going back to engine power and them being that little bit lighter, it's not exactly a crash diet, but it's something. It does suggest that Fernando is genuinely excited, and he'll be repping an Adrian Newey design car for the first time, scratching that 25-year-old itch. Yeah, none of this guarantees success, because F1 loves humiliating overconfident peoples, but it does make the contradiction stop looking like incompetence, and more like a team protecting its long-term plan in public, whilst also wrestling with the deals of real engineering and organisation issues in private. So while it may look like Aston Martin feels a bit lost, they actually are not. They are still transforming themselves into a works team, and Honda is right to start to pedal things back a little bit, that things are not expected to go completely smoothly overnight. It might be the same over at Alpine, them kind of going the opposite way in not being a works operation and now being a customer operation, and all the perks that will come from that, because there are some perks. I have talked about it before, especially for the fact, well, they don't have to spend several tens of millions of dollars on engine development to have no customers. And what we're getting right now with Aston is a mixture of confidence and caution and nostalgia and anxiety. It's everything everywhere all at once. So it's fair to suggest that we're all a little bit bamboozled as to where they are right now. We're left in this complete haze as to what to think. And that might be for the best, and Aston Martin may not mind that, hence the vague messaging. I'm not saying they've completely cancelled the hype train that will be pulling out of their own station, but they have either delayed it a little bit, or they've set the speed quite a bit lower than it was before. So that means when it does come off the rails and becomes an absolute train wreck, it's that little bit easier to get it back on the track again. But I am not vague at all in telling you that you really need to check out this video, because I really think you will like that one. I'll see you over there.